I never thought I would let an Apache into my house, especially one wearing a hide and smelling of the smoky raids I had heard about every night around the fire. For the 15 years since Martha's death, my life had been a simple routine, tending to the cattle, checking the water tank, patching the roof when the wind blew, and sitting quietly on the old wooden chair on the porch each evening, whispering a few words to her. I needed no one, wanted no one, and no longer believed in anything beautiful after all I had seen in war and life on the harsh frontier. Then that morning the heat was scorching. The sun beat down on the cracked earth where I lived, threatening to break every inch of it. I stepped outside intending to check the water tank, as I did every day when I saw a figure sprawled near the fence, a man not white with disheveled black hair smeared with blood and dirt. At first, I stood still. My heart began to pound, not with shock, but with alarm. I knew that figure, that beaded cloth, the scent of sage in his hair, that was an Apache. And if the stories I'd heard around the bar were true, then a man like him shouldn't be helped. He was a murderer. The one who burned down my house, kidnapped my daughter, made my friends disappear without a trace. I should go back and get my old gun from the house and wait for him to die like a wounded animal in the desert. Who in this neighborhood wouldn't? But my feet betraying my thoughts moved toward him. Not because I was brave, not because I pitied him, but because I couldn't tear my eyes away from the way his hands clawed at the ground as if clinging to the last shreds of life he had left. He didn't beg. He didn't cry. He just lay there breathing raggedly, looking at me. Those eyes, no fear, only pain, exhausted, but not cowardly, reminded me of the young soldiers who died in my arms years ago in the trenches where no one could win. I hated this feeling. I hated myself for letting my heart soften, for remembering Martha and her words, "Help others, Jeremiah. Don't let hatred blind your eyes." She was dead, and I was left with the scars and the hatred I'd nurtured like a watchdog. I should have turned away, but instead I knelt. The smell of blood was overwhelming. His shirt was torn down the side, the wound so deep I could see the ribs underneath. I couldn't understand his language, but that look in his eyes, it said, "Save me or let me die with honor." And I, who had lost everything to people like him, bent down, put my hands under his back, and lifted him up as if to carry a part of my own pain. His blood soaked into my shirt, hot as the years of anger I had held tight. As I stepped onto the porch steps, my feet stopped. In the distance, against the heat-hazed sky, were streaks of dust cavalry or other Apaches I didn't know. But I knew one thing for sure: I had just done what everyone in town would call crazy. I had brought an Apache once considered my sworn enemy into the house. On Martha's old table, where we had mended our clothes and put our meager meals, there was now a dying man whose name I did not know. I should have hated him. I had hated them all. But now, with his blood on my hands and his faint breath close to my ear, all I felt was this: if I let him die without doing anything, I would be no different from those I had condemned. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew that in that moment between hatred and compassion, I chose not to back down. I kept my eyes on the window. The dust trails were clearer now. 5 horsemen were galloping toward my farm, the hooves and the glint of spears in the scorching sun. I laid him, the wounded Apache, on the table, trying to keep his breathing steady. He was still not fully awake, but those dim, bright eyes seemed to know what was coming. My heart was in turmoil. Every little movement felt like it was being tied by 1,000 strings of anxiety. What should I do? Lock the door, hold my gun and wait, or hide in the basement like I did when I was a kid, hiding from storms? But then I remembered his eyes, not pleading, not cowardly, and the slight movement of his hand just to pull from his belt. A small silver object that glinted coolly in the scorching sun, a badge engraved with the symbol of the clan leader. My heart sank to the bottom. I knew that thing. I'd seen it on the wanted poster in the tavern. It was the mark of a chief, not just a warrior. And I, Jeremiah Whitmore, a widowed farmer living quietly on the frontier, had just saved the son of an Apache chief. Not everyone got such an honor, but at this moment all I felt was danger. Very dangerous. The hooves stopped at the fence. 5 Apache warriors, their faces painted with war paint, stood there like bronze statues, silent, powerful. The leader had steely eyes and a scar that ran from ear to chin, a man I later learned was Takakota Ayana's uncle. They didn't need to speak. Their presence was enough to make my heart clench. I stepped out onto the porch, my arms outstretched, unarmed. "He's in there," I said, Badly wounded. I've bandaged him. I think it was from a cavalryman's sword. They didn't answer right away. I could see one man's hand tighten around the handle of an axe. One wince, one wrong word, and I could die right there on this porch. The tension was like a bowstring stretched tight to the breaking point. "You brought him into the house?" Takakota asked, his voice rough like a stone rolling over gravel. I nodded. "He's dying. I can't just let him be." Takakota looked at me for a long time. His eyes seemed to be looking into my every thought. I wasn't trying to act. I was just telling the truth. Because at that moment, lies were meaningless. Then he walked up the steps slowly but firmly. No one else followed. I opened the door for him. Inside, Ayana was still breathing heavily, but her eyes had regained some of their color. When he saw Takakota, his lips moved, saying something in their language. Takakota listened, then turned to me. He said. Takakota hesitated, as if choosing his words. He gave him water from his own cup. He used the cloth of his woman, his wife, to bandage his wound. I nodded. That's all. Takakota looked at me again, but this time the look was different. It wasn't just wary, there was something like respect. Maybe I imagined it, but I saw him nod slightly, then walk towards Ayana. They spoke for a long time, fast, urgent, in their language. I just stood there listening to the conversation like the drumbeat of an ancient ritual. Then Takakota turned to me, his voice calm but hard, as sharpened steel. Ayana said, "You still gave him food. Your last meal." I didn't know what to say. I glanced at the iron pot on the stove, empty. It was the last of the beans and bacon I had. I'd planned to ride into town the next morning, but last night when Ayana was shivering with cold, I'd cooked it all, spooning it into the dying stranger's mouth. "He's hungry," I said. "I have food, that's all." Takakota didn't answer right away, but this time I saw his shoulders relax. He looked at me for a long time, then nodded. "Between us," he said, "much blood has been shed. I know that. But today I did what no one else would dare do. I didn't see an enemy, I saw a man." And then in that moment, all the tension burst into admiration. In the eyes of those warriors, I, an outsider, had crossed the line. They no longer saw me as an invader, but as someone who could be accepted. Not because of promises, not because of fame or fortune, but because I chose to save people when no one forced me to. Ayana, her face pale but full of light, closed her eyes slightly, as if just by the presence of her loved ones he could rest. And I, standing there for the first time in my life, felt small in front of something bigger than all the hatred, borders, and ethnicities. My heart, after so many years of being closed, opened for the first time to something nameless. Maybe it was faith. Maybe it was the beginning of something new. Just as I thought things might be settled for a while, that I had done the right thing, another disaster struck. Just as I put my hand on Takakota's shoulder, as if to share some glimmer of reassurance from the yard, came the pounding of horses' hooves, much heavier and rougher. Not Apache cavalry, not rhythmic like the wind. This was the riding of men with guns who wanted to prove something with blood. I stepped out onto the porch and saw him, Buck Henley, and 5 of his companions. He was the embodiment of everything I hated in the world. The ugly scar that ran down his face, the eyes that were as empty as a bottomless well, and the necklace made from an Apache scalp. I had heard of him, the bounty hunter on Indian heads, the one who burned entire tribes alive just to collect a few pieces of skin that met the government's standard price. He stopped his head high like a wolf spotting prey. "Whitmore," he roared, "I know they're in your house. Send them out or I'll get them." I felt the gun at my back heat up in my palm, but I didn't lift it. I had to keep my cool. I had to calculate. Inside my house was a dying Ayanato and Takakota and 4 other warriors, and outside were 6 hired killers. No humanity, no rules. And me, I had only an old gun and a fragile belief in right and wrong. "There's no one in the house but me," I said loudly. My voice was as dry as sand. "Just an old man in an empty kitchen." Henley sneered. "You think I'm a fool? My men saw footprints, smelled smoke. Their horse shit wasn't even dry." He pointed to the ground. "And look," the man next to him held up an Apache arrow that had fallen into the yard. "You're lying, Whitmore." My hands began to shake. One wrong move and blood would be spilled. Then from behind me, I heard the cabin door open. I turned, my heart stopping. Takakota stepped out. Do not carry weapons. Do not draw bow or hold spear. He stepped out with only bare feet and strangely calm eyes. I am Takakota of the Chiricahua line, he said loudly in English, so clear that Henley could not pretend not to understand. I have come for my nephew who is wounded in this house. We do not seek war. Henley spat on the ground. I don't need a reason to kill an Apache. Today you die. And he pulled out a gun. But he wasn't the first to pull the trigger. Takakota was quicker. He was unarmed, but his gun was blown out of his hand by a shot from an Apache warrior hiding behind a stable. Everything happened faster than he could have imagined. Takakota's warriors, who had not been caught off guard, turned the ambush. In less than 10 seconds, 3 of the 6 men accompanying Henley were pinned down by bows knives and oaken hands. But the other 2 were not to be outdone. One named Jackson fell off his horse, rolled like a battle-hardened soldier, and fired a shot through the cabin wall right where Ayana lay. I heard a groan, the sound of a body falling. I ran in. Ayana was shot. He tried to stand, reaching for the gun that was placed nearby. But blood poured from his side more than before. His vision blurred, his legs buckled. I didn't have time to think, just rushed forward, blocking him from Jackson's second shot. The bullet then sliced across my shoulder, making me spin halfway and fall. Pain, but not death. In the chaos, I heard Takakota shout the command, shouted in Apache, short, sharp, precise. And his brothers poured out like the night. The battle was over quickly, and Henley, his hands covered in blood, was struck down. But he didn't die. No one killed him. Because Takakota knew if he killed him, the army would come. Killing people like Henley would bring war. Let him live, he would come back. But they still had time to prepare. And something even greater than the weapon had just been born: loyalty. Ayana, though dying, stood up, leaning against the door, blood staining his shirt. I am Ayana, son of Chief Nalnish, he declared. And this man, Jeremiah, is my family. I stood there, blood dripping onto the porch, watching all the Apache warriors' eyes turn toward me. No one spoke, but I knew. From that moment on, I was no longer alone. The pain in my left shoulder was like a slow burn, but I didn't cry out or wince. Ayana was unconscious again, lying on Martha's old tablecloth, where I used to set her breakfast every Sunday, and her blood had soaked through the cloth I'd sworn I'd never use again after she left. Takakota was sitting beside her, trying to staunch the bleeding, his face as cold as stone, but I could see the worry beneath his every gesture. My little house, once quiet and lonely, has now become a makeshift battlefield, a field hospital, and the last refuge of righteousness. We all knew Henley would return, not alone, not with 5 men with silver guns. He would ride to the nearest military post with a lie about a white man being held hostage by the Apaches and hear the bugles blowing before dusk tomorrow. 20 riflemen horses, light artillery, iron discipline. What did we have? A half-collapsed log cabin, 5 tired warriors and me wounded, and no better shot than anyone else. Takakota, having finished bandaging me, sat down by the oil lamp. He can't move, he said softly, as if talking to himself. If he leaves, he'll die on horseback. I nodded. I knew. But it wasn't the fear of death that made me feel so tight in my throat. It was the feeling that, for the first time in my life, I had a new family, a community, and all of that was on the verge of being crushed. I'm not running, I said, my voice as firm as the nails I'd used to hammer into the fence. I live here. Martha used to say there are things worth dying for, but nothing worth living for. Takakota looked at me for a long time. Then he whistled softly. The 4 remaining warriors appeared immediately, as if they had never left the cabin. He spoke to them in his own language. I didn't understand everything, but when they turned to me, I saw something had changed. It was no longer a look of scrutiny or suspicion. It was a look reserved for comrades. You just said something the Apaches know better than anyone, Takakota translated. You said life is worse than death. They respect that. I sat with my back against the wall, my hands clasping my swollen shoulders. My heart was strangely calm. I didn't pray for a miracle. I just thought of a quiet night by the fire, Martha smiling at me, and I felt no regrets. We won't win if we fight hand to hand, I said. No, Takakota agreed, but if Ayana is kept alive, then his words will carry weight. He is the son of the Nalnish chief, Takakota said, his eyes distant. If he lives and his words are heard, all 3 clans will set out. Then I said we fight not to win, but to buy time. Keep Ayana alive, and give her brother a reason to come. Takakota nodded, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw a smile flicker across his face. Not of hope, but of recognition. He stood up and ordered his men to dig trenches around the cabin, erect barricades, and spread oil logs in dangerous directions. I struggled to stand up too, trying to help them with even just one hand. Every step felt like I was on fire, but I didn't stop. That night, we did not sleep. There were no blankets, only the dry wind and the crackling of burning wood. Ayana was unconscious, but still alive. Takakota did not take his eyes off his nephew. I, for one, looked west, where Henley would return, bringing destruction with him. No one said it, but we all knew this could be our last night. And strangely, I felt at peace, not because I want to die, but because I am willing to die for what I believe is right. For a stranger I once hated, for an act that has made me a traitor, for a community I once considered an enemy, and for a memory, my late wife, who taught me that humanity has no skin color. I have never seen a sunrise like that. Before the sun had fully risen, the earth shook. The first sound was not of birds or wind, but of horses' hooves thick and drumming from the horizon. I left the cabin, my shoulders still bandaged, and stepped out onto the porch into the pale morning mist. And the sight I saw made my heart clench with astonishment. An entire army of Apaches so numerous I lost count. Not 10, not 5,500 warriors from 3 different tribes rolled like a wave toward my little ranch. Black, brown, and tan horses covered in brocade. Spears gleamed in the dim sunlight. Warriors held their heads high, their faces painted in ancient patterns, a living picture of pride, unity, and raw power. And leading them was he, Chief Nalnish. I recognized him even before I could see his face. His horseback stance was straight as an oak. His eagle feather cloak was draped across his shoulders. His face was as hard as the red Arizona soil, but his eyes, those eyes were something I would never forget, the look Ayana had had on her the first night I lifted him from the ground. Nalnish rode slowly up to the porch, then dismounted without a word. The other warriors stopped in unison. Not a sound. No one drew their weapons. They had not come to fight. They had come for a ceremony greater than war. I stood there, the gun still leaning against the wall like a familiar part of my body, but I didn't need it anymore. I am Jeremiah Whitmore, I said, not as an introduction, but as a declaration. I needed him to know my name, not as a white man, but as a man who had chosen to be different. Nalnish nodded his eyes, not searching, but thoughtful. My son lives, he said in English, clear, slow, and ringing like a bell in my mind. Because of your kindness. I didn't know how to respond. My mind was still filled with the blood, the sound of gunfire, Ayana's grimace, as she struggled to stand between me and Henley. I was just doing what she would do, I whispered. My wife, Martha, she always believed that people are not born to hate. Nalnish looked at me for a long time, then nodded more deeply this time. Then he pulled a small object from a leather pouch at his side. I saw the blue light glint as he opened his hand, a badge made of silver and turquoise, engraved with symbols so ancient I couldn't tell the date. This, he said, belongs to you. He walked up the steps and placed it around my neck. When the badge touched my skin, I didn't feel cold. I felt something strange warm, as if it carried the soul of the tribe. You have shed your blood for ours. Nalnish continued. That cannot be forgotten. From this day forward, you are the brother of the Apache. Whoever harms you harms us. Whoever protects you, we protect. At that moment, 500 warriors knelt down in unison. Not a drum beat, not a shout, just a silent action, but it shook like thunder in my heart. I don't know what to do. I have never had anyone kneel before me. I'm just an old farmer living quietly among the steppes and memories. But now people who were once called barbarians' enemies bow down to honor me, not with promises, but with the traditions of their ancestors. Ayana was awake by then, leaning against the doorframe. His face was pale and sweaty, but his eyes were bright. When he saw his father, he said softly, loud enough for everyone to hear, he'd his family. I saw Nalnish close his eyes for a moment. Perhaps he was whispering something to his ancestors. Then he turned to me and smiled. Not the smile of a warrior, but of a father. In the distance, we saw the dust, the cavalry. Henley had kept his word, but when they saw the Apaches stretching out like a black sea, they stopped. No one dared to advance. They don't know who I am, but they know who is protecting me. And in that moment, as the army turned and retreated, I understood that my life had changed forever. No longer Jeremiah Whitmore, the lonely farmer. No longer the widow who lives with memories. I am a blood brother of the Apache, a testament to what Martha believed until the end of her life, that humanity can overcome all walls, all hatreds, all boundaries. I stood on the porch, my hand clasped around the badge, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was home. Not a place, but a place to myself.